The severed hand. I've been a police officer in South Jersey since I was 23. Most of my career has been spent on uneventful shifts, dealing with the usual calls, disturbances, shoplifting, and the occasional more serious incident. The job is usually pretty quiet in my county, not the high-speed chases or intense crimes you see in TV shows. Once in a while, something odd happens, but those nights are few and far between. I've worked every shift there is, including the night shift, where you tend to encounter the weirder calls, though most of those turn out to be nothing. But one night, everything changed. It was just another night shift. The road I was patrolling was one of those quiet, isolated stretches. No streetlights, just the soft hum of my patrol car as I cruised along, surrounded by woods on both sides. Everything seemed calm, no calls, just the silence of the night. That's when I saw the reflection of taillights in the grass on the side of the road. I thought maybe someone had broken down, so I slowed down to investigate. As I got closer, I could see that the driver's side door of the car was wide open. I didn't see anyone inside, but something felt off. I was already preparing to stop and get out of my car to check things out, maybe offer assistance. As I slowed, I saw something, step out of the car. The figure stood by the open door for a second before turning and running into the woods. I immediately called in the situation on my radio, requesting a check for a suspicious person or vehicle. With my hand on my holster and flashlight ready, I stepped out of the car, trying to be as cautious as possible. In situations like this, you always have to expect the worst. I walked toward the front of the car, scanning the area. Inside, it looked empty at first glance, but there was something that stopped me cold. An overwhelming, nauseating smell coming from the car. It was like something was rotting, something foul, like the scent of decaying flesh. I stepped closer, trying to keep my composure. There were no people in the car, but the passenger side and rear seats were soaked with blood. Bloodied tissues and paper towels were scattered across the floor, dark red with streaks of dried blood. My stomach turned at the sight, but I forced myself to keep looking. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was definitely hiding in the woods. I spun around, flashing my light into the trees. "Come out of the woods," I yelled, but no one responded. The footsteps stopped as quickly as they had started, but then, just beyond the tree line, I heard a voice. It was deep, almost guttural, muffled by the trees in the distance, but it was there. I couldn't make out what it said, but the voice was unmistakable. My gut twisted, and I prepared myself for whatever might come next. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice steady but my heart racing. "Are you hurt?" I stepped a little closer to the woods, flashlight in hand, and repeated myself. "Are you hurt?" Still no response. The voice I had heard didn't sound like someone in pain, like someone who had just been through something traumatic. And why would they have run into the woods if they were in serious trouble? Something wasn't right. I returned to the car to take another look, trying to make sense of the situation. As I moved around to the back of the vehicle, something caught my eye. The car had no license plates. It looked stolen. I carefully went back inside the car, trying to piece together any clues I could. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was something heavy, wrapped in bloodied paper towels. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it, wearing gloves to protect myself from the blood. The moment I uncovered the object, I almost lost it. A severed hand, soaked completely in dark red blood, lay in front of me. It took me a moment to fully process what I was seeing. My mind was struggling to comprehend it. This was real. It was a human hand, and it was fresh. The blood still visible and dripping in places. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The situation had just escalated from strange to terrifying. I immediately radioed for backup, reporting what I had found. Possible murder, need backup immediately. I flicked on my cruiser's emergency lights to signal my location. I wasn't sure if the person who had run into the woods was still out there, or if they were even alive. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the area. The K-9 unit was brought in, and for hours we combed through the woods, looking for blood trails, any sign of the suspect. But there was nothing. No blood trails, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The car was taken into evidence and processed. We learned that it had been reported stolen by a nearby resident. The man had no idea who could have taken it. We collected fingerprints from the steering wheel, and DNA samples were taken from the severed hand in the hopes of identifying who it belonged to. But there was nothing. No matches came back. Not a single lead. The more we looked into it, the more baffling it became. Whoever had been in that car, whoever had left that severed hand, was a ghost. The blood in the car didn't seem to match anyone connected to the vehicle. And the voice I had heard in the woods? It was like they had vanished into thin air. To this day, the case remains unsolved. No one knows who the driver was, who the hand belonged to, or what really happened that night in those woods. That's the thing about this job. You can spend years investigating and still walk away with more questions than answers. Some mysteries, it seems, are better left unsolved. The house in the hills. It was a quiet evening when my partner and I were dispatched to a remote area of the county to follow up on a signal from an ankle monitor. The tether, belonging to a man named Samuel, had gone offline earlier in the day. His last known location pinged to an old, nearly forgotten house nestled in the hills. As seasoned officers in the sheriff's department, handling strange calls was nothing new, but this house would linger in my mind for weeks to come. The driveway was overgrown, with weeds stretching halfway up the tires of our patrol vehicle. The house itself seemed to sag under its own weight, its windows dark and vacant. My partner knocked on the door while I circled to check the perimeter. The air was heavy, almost electric, as if a storm was brewing, though the sky was clear. Through the crack of a shattered window, I could hear the faint sound of music. Something old, scratchy, like it came from a gramophone. As I peered inside, the music stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent. My radio crackled as my partner called me back to the front. The door had been answered by a frail, elderly man, his face gaunt and eyes glassy. He stood motionless, as though he'd been expecting us. "We're looking for Samuel," my partner stated, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and shuffled into the house, leaving the door open for us to follow. The interior was worse than the exterior. Peeling wallpaper, a damp, mildew-laden smell, and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. As we stepped inside, the old man whispered almost inaudibly, "He's here." Upstairs. The stairs groaned under our boots as we ascended, the man's shadow vanishing into the dim hallway below. The upper floor was eerily cold, and each step seemed to stretch the distance to the top. The hallway was lined with doors, all shut, with deep scratches etched into the wood near their handles. My partner tried the first door, but it wouldn't budge. The second opened with a creak, revealing a room filled with children's toys scattered across the floor. "That's strange," my partner muttered. The toys looked pristine, but a thick layer of dust coated everything else. The air smelled of decay, though no obvious source was visible. I felt a chill as I turned, and there he was, the old man standing in the hallway, staring blankly at us. "Samuel isn't here," my partner said, trying to mask his unease. The old man tilted his head, a smile curling at his lips, and said, "You haven't looked hard enough." Something felt deeply wrong. My partner and I exchanged glances and decided to search the rest of the house quickly. Every room felt like stepping into another time. A parlor with faded floral wallpaper, a kitchen with antique appliances, a bedroom with a single rocking chair facing an empty crib. In the last room, the attic door caught our attention. The pull string hung low, swaying slightly as though recently disturbed. My partner reached up and yanked it. The ladder descended with a sharp creak, releasing a faint but foul smell. The attic was suffocatingly warm, filled with forgotten relics and dusty boxes. At the far end, something caught my eye. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room. I shone my flashlight on it, and it moved. My breath caught as a figure. A man, hunched and skeletal, stepped out from the shadows, his ankle tether blinking faintly. "Samuel," my partner called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low, guttural groan before retreating into the darkness. We moved quickly, but when we reached where he'd been standing, there was nothing but an old chair and a crumpled photograph of a family. We searched the house again, but found no sign of him or the old man. As we descended the stairs to leave, the front door was wide open, though neither of us had touched it. Outside, standing at the edge of the overgrown yard, was the old man. His head tilted as though he was watching something we couldn't see. When we returned to our vehicle, I glanced at the clock. Only 15 minutes had passed since we entered the house, yet it felt like hours. As we drove away, my partner kept checking the rearview mirror, but the road behind us was empty. Neither of us spoke much after that, and the case of Samuel remains unsolved. We haven't returned to that house in the hills, and frankly, I hope we never have to. Something about it still gnaws at the edges of my mind, like an unanswered question that will never have a satisfying answer. My family and I live throughout the middle of Georgia. Not many stories come out of this area, and this one I'm about to share makes us glad of that fact. My cousin, who I'll call Bob, has been a police officer for 5 years. He went into the force bright-eyed and optimistic. I guess like so many do, it sounds corny, but he genuinely wanted to make a difference and help improve the lives of the people in his community. One day, they got an alert from the house somewhere between Macon and Roberta. To hear Bob tell it, it was a place that people had thought was abandoned for years. Gives you an idea of the state the house was in. Anyway, when they arrived, an older gentleman was sitting on the steps outside the front door with his hand in his pockets. Bob and the other officer approached him and were alarmed to see that the man was crying, while not crying really, but sobbing, and he was also muttering something to himself about how awful it is. They tried to question the man, but the guy was completely incoherent. It didn't take but a couple of seconds to figure out that the poor guy was traumatized, as his partner called for another car. Bob drew his gun and decided to enter the house. The smell inside the house was overpowering rancid. He told me that the kitchen and living room were a total wreck. It was clear the owners of the house were hoarders, pots and pans, stacked damn near to the ceiling, spoiled food all over the table, takeout containers scattered all over the floor. Disgusting as procedure dictates. Bob called out to see if anyone would answer. Silence. He told me that even with all his training and experience over those past 5 years, his heart rate was already building fast. Gone at the ready, he checked out the living room and saw nobody was there either. He made his way down the hall where the smell was getting much worse just as it all became too much. He covered his mouth and nose and opened the door to what he suspected was the bedroom. In the bed were 2 corpses, gray-skinned and covered with flies. Despite his churning stomach, Bob decided to go in for a closer look. a decision he said he's regretted since one of the corpses was male, the other female. The skin on their faces was already starting to fall off, and the flies were flying in and out of their mouths. Some were landing and sitting on their eyeballs. As Bob inspected the female's corpse, he was horrified to find that she was holding an even smaller dead body, an infant. It wasn't until a large cockarack crawled out of the dead infant's mouth that Bob ran outside the house, doubled over, and threw up his lunch all over the steps the man had been sitting on. When the other cars finally arrived, they were able to do a more thorough inspection. The older man that Bob and his partner had met when they first arrived was a former co-worker and friend of the dead man. They'd worked together at a peach packing company. The man hadn't showed up for over a week, and he'd gone to their house to see if he was okay. The poor man had been the first to see that horrible sight in the bedroom. The story that they put together was that the wife and husband had at some point become addicted to opioids after some kind of operation. A year or so before they had started abusing painkillers together, and the addiction grew and grew until they started shooting up and snorting heroin. Their daughter, who wasn't more than a couple years old, had died of neglect. When the husband and wife discovered their baby's corpse, they finally broke completely and decided to end themselves. The coroner found enough heroin in both their bodies to kill them twice over Bob's still on the force, but he started drinking a little too much. After that, he's been going to therapy, and he's since managed to get his drinking under control. But almost every time we talk, he says that he still has nightmares about that poor child's corpse, and in his nightmares the baby's still crying.